Stuff to hear kids tell the story. So, we are entering Advent. And we are going to do a series called A Christmas Revolution. So, as you just saw, the story can be told a number of different ways. And the way a story is told matters, right? The way somebody tells it will give you different perspectives. And depending on who the interpreter of the story is, will also determine how you see it. The message can be understood very differently, depending on those things. So, as we come into Advent, this is, for many of us, a familiar story that we rehearse every year. It's something that we celebrate and we go through it, and then we get to Christmas, and it's kind of routine. It's something that we've heard before. As Westerners living in the United States of America with much abundance, we find ourselves in a sort of a strange place during Advent. Because we're the sort of people who are free. We have much, and we don't need a whole lot, for the most part. We're generally a non-oppressed people compared to most of the world. And we might have bad days or some bad experiences, and we might even have a really hard life. But our context is very different than for those whom the hope of the Messiah was originally for. So, an oppressed people will hear the message of Advent differently, generally speaking. Now, that doesn't mean we should feel bad or wish that we lived in some oppressive place like Iraq or Syria where Christians are being killed and persecuted all the time. It just means that we hear it differently, and we need to be aware of that we have a certain context to filter things with. The great theologian Jürgen Moltmann from Germany wrote, "Who is the subject of the Messianic hope? Free people do not really need a Messiah to save them. They can help themselves. But how can the people who dwell in darkness create the great light all by themselves? How can alienated people beget the Messianic human being? The Messianic hope was never the hope of the victors and the rulers. It was always the hope of the defeated and the ground down. So the hope of the poor is nothing other than the Messianic hope." So we can see immediately that we don't immediately relate to this. It's not the context for most of us. And so we hear the story and we hear a certain thing. What I want to do this morning is sketch a brief history of Israel's life and their exile leading up into the time of Advent. And this is going to be a little bit of information. Hopefully it's not too much overkill with that, but I want to give context for the story from what we can best picture of what it was like for the first hearers, because the way a story is told and the way a story is heard really matters. So, first thing we're going to look at is a divided monarchy. This is a map. Maybe many of you have maybe seen this before, but this is the kingdom of Israel after it divided. So on the north you have Israel, on the south you have Judah, and Jerusalem is that little star just on the north edge of Judah. So this is shortly after King David's reign, and then his son Solomon became king, and after Solomon's death, the kingdom split. There was lots of political turmoil. So let's look at the next slide, and we're going to go through these dates quickly. Okay, so 1005 BC, King David's kingship is established. We all know about King David. He slayed Goliath, and he becomes the king of Israel, through whom God makes some pretty staggering promises about his kingdom will never end. David's kingdom is passed on to his son Solomon after he dies, and shortly after Solomon's death, the kingdom divides. So that's in 928 or so. Then, if you read through the books of Kings, you see turmoil and kings diverting and going against the ways of the Lord over and over and over again. And Israel gets led astray, and all kinds of warnings come up through the prophets about you need to get back to the ways of the Lord, or there's going to be destruction, there's going to be disaster. And sure enough, the disaster and the judgment that God foretold through the prophets came. And so in 722, the Assyrians from up north, their empire came down and they took over the northern kingdom of Israel. And the 10 tribes that were existing in that kingdom were taken into captivity, and they were never really heard from again. A little bit later, 587 or so, the Babylonians come and they conquer the southern kingdom, which is where Jerusalem is, which is where the temple is. So it's bad that the northern kingdom was taken, but the capital was still in place, and they were able to fend off the Assyrians. But when the Babylonians rose up, they came and they took over Jerusalem and they leveled it. This was a devastating, horrific thing in Israel's history. The temple that they had dedicated to God, that Solomon had built, was leveled. Not only the temple, but the entire city. The walls were knocked down, left in ruins. Most of the people are taken off into Babylon, into captivity. And they're now the subjects of a new empire. Now, if you're an Israelite in ancient Israel, this is a major, major faith crisis. Because the question is, where is God? Where is this eternal kingdom that God promised David? This is a major crisis. In the ancient Near East, if another nation came and won a war against you, the general understanding of that was that their God was more powerful than your God. So for ancient Israel, this is crisis. Now, of course, Israel believes that God has not been overtaken, but has actually brought judgment on them. So they are still trusting in God, but this is difficult times. In 539, the Persian Empire rises up and conquers the Babylonians. And as soon as that happens, King Cyrus graciously allows some of the Jews to go back to the land of Jerusalem and to begin rebuilding the temple. And this is what you read about in Nehemiah and Ezra. They begin to kind of rebuild. But they are still under Persian rule. In 333, Alexander the Great rises up and he conquers the Persians. And so the Greeks now own the land. And if you know about Alexander the Great, he loved making everything Greek. And so his mission was to Hellenize the whole empire, and that happened. He did a very good job of that in his short 10 years before he died in 323. He made everything Greek. And it wasn't too long after that, that because the Greek culture had so influenced everything, even the Greek language had taken over. And so the Israelites now come up with their first Greek translation of the Old Testament. So now they have what's called the Septuagint, symbolized by the LXX, the 70, which has a whole story behind it, but we won't get into that. So the Greek influence is now throughout the empire. So they live under that rule for a while. In 198 BC, shortly after Alexander the Great's death, his kingdom is kind of separated into 4 different groups. There's the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and they are on either side of Palestine in those territories. And so, again, Palestine, Jerusalem, is right in the middle of this conflict again. And they are living under relative peace until until the Seleucids take Palestine from the Ptolemies. When this happens, the high priesthood and the Jewish religious establishment gets corrupted because it can be bought, because there's all kinds of infiltration of foreigners and different ideals. And so if you're a Jew living in this time, you are watching your world through centuries. You're watching your story. You're watching your culture. You're watching your people slowly get obliterated. Slowly, slowly, slowly. You're losing your identity because kingdom after kingdom is coming in, taking over, redoing things, making you conform to their way, to their culture, to their language, to their religion. And can you imagine how hard it must have been for the Jewish people to hold on to the God of Israel? Difficult time. Well, shortly after the Seleucids kind of take over, there's a guy that rises up. His name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. It's quite the name. So, you know, anybody wants to name their kid something unique, I got an idea for you. Although he's not a good guy, so I wouldn't name it after him. Anyway, Antiochus IV is a bad man, and he has all kinds of things going on. He's making these military conquests into different places, and he's doing it in Egypt, and he gets kind of pushed back by the Romans, and some other things happen, and he gets really angry, and he decides he's going to take it out on somebody. And who do you think he takes it out on? The Jews, because, you know, they're there. And they've been a stubborn, obstinate people holding on to their God and holding on to their law. And he is sick and tired of dealing with them. And so he punishes them horrendously, slaughters thousands of them, does horrendous things, goes into the temple, sacrifices a pig on the altar, which a Jew does not look highly upon a pig because it's an unclean animal. He does everything he can to desecrate their way of life, their faith, their identity. He sacks the temple treasury, takes out the money. He establishes ritual prostitution in the temple. I mean, this guy is awful. So imagine if you're a Jew trying to be faithful, and this is what's going on, and the question is, where is God? Where is God? How can God let these things happen? Well, the Jews had had about enough. In 167, a couple years after Antiochus does all this stuff, Antiochus sends a couple more representative and some other people into one of the synagogues to force Jews to sacrifice a pig on the altar because he just enjoyed making them do things that they were against. And so when he does this, one of the guys rises up, a guy named Mattathias, and he has had it. And he rises up and he kills the official and the guy with him, and they all run for the mountains because they know now they've started a war. And so all the Jews run out to the mountains with Mattathias, and they begin guerrilla warfare. And now they are in conflict. Mattathias' son, Judas Maccabeus, becomes the leader of this revolt, and it goes down in history as the Maccabean Revolt, if you've ever heard of that. And after they actually fight for a while, and the Jews actually win. They push the Seleucids out of their territory, and they have a victory. After all this time, they finally get a little victory. They get a little bit of land back. And so hope begins to rise. Maybe God is coming back to Jerusalem. Maybe the time for the revolt is near, and the Messiah is going to rise up. And you see the hope building. We got a victory. Okay, things are changing. All right, now they're excited. So the Maccabean Revolt is a huge, huge landmark in this time period. The Jews still celebrate this in the Feast of Hanukkah. They celebrate this victory. So this becomes a big deal. So years and years go on, and there are little revolts here and there. Most of them don't go anywhere. But there is this spirit of revolt. In 64 BC, Pompey, the Roman general, comes in, and he sweeps the entire landscape, and the Roman Empire rises up. And now the Romans are in charge. And so all of this time, if you're a Jew, your history has become oppressor after oppressor after oppressor after conqueror after where is God, where is God, where is God? Has he forsaken us? Faith crisis. In 40 BC, Herod the Great gets appointed to rule Palestine. He's given the right. And again, the priesthood and the political officials have corrupted themselves completely and looked for ways to compromise with those in power. So most of the Jews do not really like Herod, and they don't really accept him as their king, but he's a better ruler than a lot of people have been. And Herod does some amazing things, which we'll get into in a couple of weeks, because he's a great guy too. So we will see about that. But he builds a magnificent temple, rebuilds it, does some other things, and gets some favor with the Jews after he does that. Okay, and in about 4 BC or so is when scholars think Jesus was born. Okay, so this is the history leading into Advent. The advent of the Son of God comes into this context. And it's a people that are waiting. When is God going to rise up? When is God going to give us our land back? When is God going to give us our temple back? When is God going to get these enemies and these pagans out of here so that we can worship him? Because that's what he promised us. So do you feel the weighty, the longing, the wait? Advent is a season of waiting. It's a season of anticipation. So as Americans who are free and don't have this kind of thing in our history, we hear the story differently. But if we want to get back to kind of the spirit of Advent, we need to recount Israel's history and look at what it might have been like for them to expect a Messiah. And after looking at this as a very bare-bones skeleton outline, can you now see what kind of Messiah that they would have expected? They would have wanted a military ruler who is going to chop down the bad guys and get them their land back. That's what they're looking for. That's how they see the Messiah. And it may have been sparked in the Maccabean revolt. We're waiting for somebody to come and deliver us, just like Moses delivered us from Egypt. Just like God has foretold in the prophets that he will send a deliverer. So their hope is in a certain kind of Messiah. And they're thinking it is time for a revolt. So let's look at our text again, verses 1 through 3 of Isaiah 64. I just want to read the first 3 verses. The cry of Isaiah. And Isaiah lived in the time of the initial part of the exile, the 700s BC. So this is clear back when it first started, when just the Assyrians had taken over. But this cry would have been repeated in their liturgies in the synagogue, in their worship times. They would have come back to these texts, prophesying, foretelling a time when God would return and deliver them from the situation they had been in. So Isaiah 64, 1 through 3 says, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens, that you would open the heavens and come down, that the mountains would tremble before you, as when fire sets twigs ablaze and causes water to boil. Come down to make your name known to your enemies and cause the nations to quake before you. For when you did awesome things that we did not expect, you came down and the mountains trembled before you." Do you see the vision? They want a powerful, mighty warrior kind of breakthrough. They are looking for power. They're looking for, boom, come down and show these people what you're all about, that you're done tolerating them. And there's a strong spirit portrayed here. Isaiah 64 is set in the context of declaring a coming vengeance against enemy oppressors. It's a cry for deliverance, looking back to the promises given to God's people through Abraham, through David, and we're waiting for the fulfillment. It's nationalistic in its scope. They fully expect God to reestablish Jerusalem as a nation state, to give them their land back, and to make them a kingdom like the kingdom of David, to make them in charge. a nation in which other nations will come bow before or join with, one of the two. They have this hope. It's a political kingdom. And they want other nations to be subservient to them, and it's an image of God's rule with political, economic, and religious power. And it's supposed to endure forever, because that's what God told David. So, this is the expectation. This is the hope. This is the longing. This is the waiting. And yet, Jesus the Messiah comes as this humble, powerless, frail baby in a manger out in the sticks. It's not a grand entrance. It's not the heavens parting and the mountains trembling. It's this humble, mostly unobserved thing. Born in a stable, he grows up working as a carpenter. And when he begins his ministry, he begins to proclaim a kingdom where everything is turned upside down. All of the expectations are sort of met, but they're sort of not. Jesus teaches a kingdom of true righteousness, justice, and peace. A kingdom where the last become first. A kingdom where the poor are blessed, and the meek are blessed, and the peacemakers are blessed. And instead of God bringing vengeance upon their enemies are offered forgiveness and invited into the kingdom. And Jesus tells his Jewish followers that they must do the same, lest they be excluded from this kingdom. It's quite a turn. It's time for a revolt, is what they believed. And yet, God is revolting against their idea and our idea of revolt, and gives them a new understanding of revolt. Because Advent is the beginning of a Christmas revolution, a revolution where mercy triumphs over judgment, where forgiveness trumps vengeance, and love is the great power of the world. Not violent, coercive power, but love is the great power. It's time for a Jesus-shaped revolt. It's time to revolt against worldly thinking that says might equals right and power equals truth. It's time to revolt against a sloppy, sentimental version of the Christmas story that allows us to kind of stay as we are and not really see our need for change. It's time to revolt against half-baked discipleship that doesn't work and doesn't give life. That's our revolt. As people who are not living in those kinds of conditions, we revolt differently. We revolt into the kingdom of God. We revolt leading with love. We revolt against the ways that would go against the way of love. We revolt against fence sitting, which is the most miserable place in human existence. To have one foot in the kingdom and one foot in the world is the most miserable place you can be. Revolt against it. It doesn't work. What do you need to revolt against? Addiction to comfort? Love of money? Hatred or unforgiveness of an enemy? Revolt against it. What about looking down on others, or despising the poor, or self-centered living? Advent invites us to sit in the discomfort of waiting for our Messiah and revolting against the things that don't work, against the things that are opposed to the kingdom that Jesus taught. Advent invites us to wait with the oppressed. Who are the oppressed among us? Because Advent is for the oppressed. Advent is for the powerless. Advent is for the poor as they long for justice. How can we revolt and come into solidarity with the people that Advent is originally for? That's our challenge. So my question this morning is twofold. One, do you see the need for revolt? Two, how specifically are you being called to revolt? Does it look like Jesus-shaped revolt? Or does it look like a worldly kind of revolt? A revolt that makes a lot of sense, considering circumstances. But does it look like Jesus? Does it look like his way of revolting? Every time we eat the bread and drink the cup, we proclaim the Lord's death, and we declare solidarity with his kingdom and with the people that he came for, with the people that he reached out to. And so our revolt is a revolt against the world's stratification of people. It's a revolt against the world's value system. It's a revolt against the world's understanding of power and who's in charge and what truth is. We are called to revolt. And it's time for a revolt. We live in a time right now where there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things that need revolted against. I think we all feel that. But let it be guided by the original Advent and the kingdom that Jesus has shown us. I'd like to invite the servers to come.